When evening comes, you say it will be fair weather, for the sky is red, and in the morning, today it will be storming, and the sky is red, and for the sky is red and overcast. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times. A wicked and adulterous generation looks for a sign, but none will be given except the sign of Jonah. Jesus then left them and went away. I will confess, until I started preparing for this class, I did not recall that that this idiom was in Matthew. I always had heard, red sky in the morning, sailor's warnings, red sky at night, sailor's delight, and I did not remember this being in Matthew 16 here. But a couple things interesting here. This is the second time, I think we actually skipped the first time when I was trying to cut something out for time, that it's mentioned about the sign of Jonah. Now, the sign of Jonah, there's one part of that we almost always go to when it mentions the sign of Jonah, which is what? 3 days, okay? But there's also something else interesting about Jonah that might actually apply here. What did Jonah end up? Who was Jonah? What did he do? So he went to Nineveh and preached among, to people that were not supposed to necessarily hear God's message, and they accepted it, much to the chagrin of Jonah and probably some other Israelites, right? There's an interesting parallel to what Christ is doing here, to what Jonah's mission was here. That he does. That the gospel is going to be opened up to the Gentiles and other groups here, just like the Word of God was able to be presented to the Ninevites during the time of Jonah. So that was just something interesting to think about. But certainly there's also the parallel of him spending the 3 days that the other reference earlier in Matthew actually hones in on a little bit. All right. Let's move on from this one and kind of go on to the next one. All right. When they went across the lake, the disciples forgot to take bread. "Be careful," Jesus said to them. "Be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees." They discussed this amongst themselves and said, "It's because we didn't bring any bread." Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked, "You have little faith. Why are you talking among yourselves about having no bread? Do you still not understand? Don't you remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000 and how many basketfuls you gathered? Or the 7 loaves for the 4,000 and how many basketfuls you gathered? How is it that you don't understand that I was not talking to you about bread? But be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees." Then they understood that he was telling them to be on guard for not the yeast used against telling them to guard against the yeast used in bread, but against the teachings of the Pharisees and Sadducees. All right. So, a couple things that are now when he crosses. Lots of times, and sometimes it's hard to remember where Jesus is, and the times are at different points. But crossing the lake again, crossing the Sea of Galilee again. He's going to be in a Gentile area again in this passage, which does have a little bit of significance in that the Pharisees and Sadducees had rules, as you can imagine, particularly the Pharisees had rules on what bread would be clean. That if you go to a Gentile's house and get bread that they have given you, there is a process that you have to do to cleanse that bread, or else you cannot eat it. There is something that is probably in the back of the disciples' minds of, "Oh, we didn't bring any bread, and we're here in the Gentile area. We probably are in a little bit of a trouble here." But I think can you imagine being like Jesus and having Jesus' response to that argument? Because I definitely can. I definitely think I would say, after all we've been through, you're worried that we think we might starve to death? That I'm worried about being hungry here. I do think there's, I definitely can see sort of the exasperation in Jesus's response here. And I think it is interesting, the yeast metaphor. We heard the yeast metaphor used earlier in the book of Matthew in more of a positive situation, but it's used a little bit more negatively here. But yeast is obviously a great metaphor in the ancient world for influence, because of, what yeast does do to bread. And so obviously you can have good influence or you can have bad influence. And so here it is talking about, the bad influence that the Pharisees and the Sadducees are having on, the Jewish community with their teachings, with their, and that he is pointing out. Now I'm flying through these first couple of sections because I want to spend a lot of time on the next thing we're going to talk about. All right. Can someone else read verses 13 through 16 here?
When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah, or one of the prophets. But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God."
Okay, so obviously I'm sure this passage is familiar to you, what we call the Great Confession that Peter makes here. Couple of things here that we bring right off the bat. I think it's interesting that this occurs in Caesarea Philippi. Caesarea Philippi is a very Gentile, very Roman city. Some scholars think it should be part of the Decapolis and not Damascus, for instance, which is a city that was in sort of the official list, and some people think that the official list may actually be wrong, and Caesarea Philippi actually should be one of the Decapolis cities. But it's a very Gentile Roman city, and so they've gone away from the crowds of Jewish followers here when this confession is made, and so they're more alone. And I could see this conversation starting as, okay, let's sit down and talk about what all's been going on with the feeding of the 5,000 and the walking on the Sea of Galilee. Let's talk about what all's been happening here. What is your all's impression of all this? So the first thing they say is a lot of the people said that they were John the Baptist and Elijah or Jeremiah, one of the prophets. What would be the significance that people would have thought that Jesus was one of those groups of people?
And John the Baptist had been beheaded.
All right, so John the Baptist had just been beheaded, and so if you think of, and when they say that, I guess I did not read into this, but when they say that he is John the Baptist, do they feel that is sort of, he is possessed by the spirit of John the Baptist? Do they feel he is performing the same mission as John the Baptist? I'm not exactly sure of that. We're going to talk very specifically about Elijah here in a second. But what would they think? The Jews that thought he was John the Baptist, who did they think John the Baptist probably was? That would be, I guess, the way I would pose this question. So, so they thought John the Baptist was Elijah, which means, what was his role? What was the role of those people? What was that role? What would the Jews view the role of John the Baptist and or Elijah to be?
Talking about the coming of the Messiah.
So they were. So the Elijah was definitely the prophesied to have to be the forerunner for the Messiah, which they were looking for. I mean, they were hoping that. So if they were saying that he was John the Baptist or Elijah, that's another way of saying, well, we think he is another forerunner, all right? Not the actual Messiah, but we think he is another forerunner. That is in a sense what they're saying. That I think it's interesting that they're away from the crowds when they decide to discuss this, okay? Because if they, as we know, some of the Jews are expecting what of the Messiah?
Expecting a military victory.
King, military victory. We're going to kick the Romans out. So we end up having this conversation in a very Roman city where that's just not, where there aren't going to be any groups of people that are going to want to do this. He probably feels the disciples are a little bit able to speak more freely because of that. That would be a way to think about that. That there's, if they come to the conclusion that this is the case, they're not going to be able to go down into town and recruit a bunch of people and we'll start a rebellion or something like that. But then, of course, we have the great confession that Simon Peter says, no, we don't think you're the forerunner. We think what? We think you're him. We think you're here. It's time. Now, obviously, Peter is wise enough to know that it's starting to get a picture of the heavenly picture more than the earthly picture. But he does feel that the time for forerunning is now past, that we have the Messiah in our presence.
So when I read this, and I don't know if this is right or not, but there's a lot of extra biblical apocalyptic literature about the Son of Man. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of speculation. Okay, who's the Son of Man? Well, Jesus talks about himself as being the Son of Man a lot of times. But they're asking, who do people say the Son of Man is? And, there's just a lot of speculation going on. Well, what's all this apocalyptic literature talking about when they say Son of Man? And they give off answers. But, Jesus asks, who is the Son of Man? And that's when Simon Peter makes that confession. Mm-hmm. Jesus is the Son of Man. Mm-hmm. Jesus talks about himself as being the Son of Man. But, here he's making that confession. You are the Messiah. Mm-hmm. Of course, I don't think they understood exactly what that meant either.
I think the Messiah you're correct. I think you're correct. I think the full picture was not into play yet, mm-hmm. as far as what exactly, because again, we're going to see in just a second, Peter struggles with what that means the Messiah is going to have to go through. That doesn't seem to make that's not adding up correctly. In his mind. And we've already talked about before that the Son of Man term that Jesus begins a conversation with, even sometimes seems to be used a little bit differently by Jesus in a couple of places. Sometimes it's more of just humanity in general, although clearly I don't think that's what he's saying here. He is clearly referring to himself here as the Son of Man. And then Peter comes back to you're not only the Son of Man, you are the Son of God. Let's all right. So now let's read Jesus' response to this confession. So I'm going to read verses 17 to 19 for me.
Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven."
All right. So, Jesus certainly confirms that what Peter, I would say this is confirming that what Peter said, the Peter is spot on. He's right. And basically says that this is revealed to you. Now that's a little bit of an interesting statement. But part of it is, if you think about it, Jesus has been a little bit. He's been performing the miracles and so forth, but he's always been sort of trying to be low key. He's a lot of times he's admonished people not to go tell people about it. He is trying to keep. There's definitely a progression that he's going through here, but does mention that the Holy Spirit has revealed this to Peter, to Simon, who we now call Peter because of this confession. Now, Peter is. I'm going to get this backwards. Peter is Greek for the Hebrew Cephas, which both mean rock, I believe. Did I say that? I think I got that right. And so this is basically saying, and that you are rock, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will overcome it. Well, not overcome it. You probably have had discussions before, so I would like to hear what you all think about this term, on this rock. Okay, this is obviously there are some people that think this means Peter himself. This is the Catholics kind of use this verse to say that this is why that Peter has become the first pope here. That is kind of they kind of present this as that argument. But I before I talk a little bit about what I think, I want to hear some of what you all have heard in the past. But I don't think that's exactly what this is meaning here. So what do you think is meant by, on this rock I will build my church? What do you think is meant by Jesus' statement?
The statement itself.
Okay, so the statement itself, that on this, the fact that the truth that Jesus Christ is the Messiah, the Son of the living God. It's that truth that the church is going to be built on.
It's a different Greek word, isn't it?
That the Greek word rock used here is not exactly Peter, correct?
Right.
Yes, that is correct. They both have the translation of rock, but it is a slightly different word. There is a little bit of the fact that it's a proper noun, and it's this article of a preposition part of that, but there is definitely differentiation in the Greek that this is not saying the same thing I just said. Definitely. That is I would agree with what Hall said. That's definitely what the way I look at this. Some people have said that he's talking about Christ himself, that is, I think it's okay to believe that, but I don't think that's exactly what Christ is trying to say there either. I think he's saying, it is this truth that we're building the church on. That I am the Messiah.
I've got another thought.
Go ahead. What'd you say?
They looked at it as I'm on came down to earth, and I'm going to build my church here on earth. That's how I look at it.
That's certainly what Christ's plan was. That's certainly what the New Testament plan always was. There was definitely that was definitely Christ's plan, and so in a sense, what is happening here is Christ. This is the first real discussion of what the future holds. That Christ really has with his disciples. This is he's talked about how to live in the kingdom of God, and certainly he's done a lot of teaching. But this is the first real discussion that Christ is having about what the future holds. Now the second clause in here, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. That's I think there's also some interesting thoughts about this particular clause of what Christ may be meaning by this statement. One thing that's important is the term Hades here would have been, the way that the Jews would have used this term would be the final resting place of when you die, not necessarily the place of torment or punishment. It would have been more of a, and so this could be viewed. It could be viewed as the gates of death. Might be one way of thinking about this. Now, when we think of gates overcoming, that is a little bit kind of an odd way of thinking about it, from our standpoint. Because what do gates usually do? What is the purpose of gates?
Keep you out, keep you safe.
Keep you in or keep you out, right? Okay, they don't. Gates don't attack people, which is sort of what we would, think of from the overcome statement. Gates, either keep people in or keep people out. If you think of this as death, the keeping in metaphor really works here. Okay, if you think of this as death, it's basically saying that, before death was final and would defeat us, now it will, that has now been conquered. That would be one way of interpreting that phrase. One thing that somebody had, I read somebody that had said something that was kind of a little bit different. Gates also in the ancient world was typically where people met, kind of in the gate of the city. And so you could think of this as where people of evil meet and make their evil plans. Those plans will no longer succeed. That would be a possible thinking. But I kind of tend to more think of the death metaphor there, that Christ is sort of showing his final victory over death here. But I can see that.
Or at the church.
The church is going to go on as well.
Right, and the church is going to be eternal. Right, the church will be eternal. Right. All right. I'm going to talk a little bit more about divine on earth and loosed in heaven when we get to it a little bit later, because that also I think is very interesting in this verse. But we'll hear that phrase again. Okay, I'll go ahead and read this one real quick. Then he ordered his disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders and chief priests and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed, and on the third day be raised to life. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. "Never, Lord, this shall never happen to you." Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." First of all, why do you think he didn't want the disciples to tell anyone about this?
Would it be so he wouldn't draw people to him?
So I do think we're still not at the end of his ministry yet, and I think as we've talked about, there's going to be a group of his followers that if they do feel he's the Messiah, we'll want to start some sort of rebellion, overthrow Rome. And so it's not time for that yet. And so I think it is, by the time we get to the events at the end of Matthew, it's time, okay? At this point, it's not time yet. At this point, he still has, his ministry still needs to continue without a crescendo. And, once this gets out, this is going to be the climax. And so he's not ready for it to climax yet. Now, he explains about the suffering, and I'm sure Peter probably was not the only one that kind of thought this was odd after we've just established he was a Messiah, but he certainly is the one, as Peter typically does, likes to speak up and says this. Which, so first of all, if you had a friend that said, "I'm going to suffer," and you told your friend, "No, you're not. That won't happen to you." Typically, we think that's a nice thing to say, right? Typically, we don't think that's a bad thing to say. And Jesus comes pretty harsh on Peter. He says, not only is it not true, he says, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me." I think there's, and you're not concerned about the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. I think there's a huge, huge lesson here. I think many times our greatest temptations do not come from people who are evil or mean evil, or I think they are people that seem to be offering a path that might be good, and they themselves are good. So it seems like it's logical it might be good. I think there's and I think when Jesus says, again, I think there's always this hard part of understanding what it means to be 100% God and 100% man. But when Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan," I do think there's a legitimate temptation here that is on Jesus. It's like, I don't have to go through this. I can stop this. And Peter seems to think it's all right for me to stop, to not do it. I think there is, there is Satan is using Peter to attack Jesus on that, on what would be a legitimate human fear that, okay, I will not enjoy this suffering. I don't want to die. The genuine human fears that you would have with these things. And I want you to keep that in mind when we get to Transfiguration in a little bit. I want you to keep these verses in mind.
Do you think at that time that Peter didn't realize that Jesus was not going to put the Roman power out of power?
I think he's certainly struggling. With what exactly is meant by all this.
So you can't be killed.
Right. That the only way you could, you would not die before everything is set right from my eyes. As far as we don't have this pagan power ruling over us. We don't have the Pharisees still in charge of. Every other time they probably think of it that the Pharisees would not be in charge of everything when Jesus was done. Because so their false teaching would go away. I would think that Peter probably has some of these conceptions in mind that it can't end that way because all these other earthly things have to be set right, and so it's going to take a while for Peter to understand what the reality is there. Okay, so I am going to skip right to the Transfiguration right now. Okay. All right, so I'll go ahead and read this. After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, and led them up to a high mountain by themselves. Then he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light. Just then appeared before them Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus. Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While he was still speaking, a bright cloud covered them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell face down to the ground, terrified. But Jesus came and touched them. "Get up," he said. "Do not be afraid." When they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus. Okay, so we call this incident the Transfiguration. There's kind of 2 mountains that are kind of thought might be where this occurred. One is Mount Tabor, but I think most scholars probably feel it is Mount Hermon. This is the location of Mount Hermon. This is the country of Syria, if you recognize that. This is the Sea of Galilee right here. This is the area that's outlined right there that we now know of as the Golden Heights. If that Israel is occupying, that's not on Syrian territory, but Israel is occupying it. Mount Hermon is almost right at the edge of that. Right at kind of the border between Syria and Lebanon and the Golden Heights is where Mount Hermon is, and that is its picture there. Caesarea Philippi, which is, we know Jesus has been around here lately, is kind of in this area. It would be right in the middle of the Golden Heights, or the northern end of the Golden Heights there, where Caesarea Philippi is, which is one reason why we definitely think it probably is this mountain that has probably occurred on. So the two figures from Israel's past that come see Christ here are Moses and Elijah. So what do Moses and Elijah mean to the Israelites? Okay, they certainly are two of the big people in their history.
It's their revealed truth that they have.
Okay, so
they prophets.
Right. So you have two. Moses definitely is. He was the lawgiver. He is the one that completely exposed what God's law was, and then Elijah is almost considered the greatest mouthpiece that God, the prophets that God actually had. He is kind of the most revered of the mouthpieces that would speak what God's will and what God's desire was. Luke's version of this actually has a sentence in there about what they were talking about. And they were talking about his departure from Jerusalem. The word that's used for departure there is basically the same word that we end up translating the book of Exodus into Exodus from. It's basically now that of course has some neat symbolism. What is, someone describe the Exodus to me in like a sentence. What is the Exodus in Israelite history?
Departure from slavery.
So it's departure from slavery into what? Into a promised land, into a land of our own. So I think there's some strong symbolism here that what Christ is doing at Jerusalem, that Elijah and Moses and himself are talking about, is a departure, not only just he will die and leave this earth, but we will talk more about that in a second, but it is going to be the established of, definitely a new promise, a new promise here, that this Exodus will have a great purpose, a glorious purpose, that it will, lead all of those that believe into a new promised land, in a sense. Why do you think they were having this? Why do you think this event is in the Bible? Why do we think they were having this conversation?
Well, at the end of it, God told them to listen to Jesus.
Okay.
Not Moses and the prophets. Listen to him.
Okay. So there's definitely some validation of Christ here.
Exonerate Jesus instead of the people of the Old Testament.
All right. Okay. So transition. All right. I think that's definitely true. I think by the time that I think I heard someone say it once that started the plan with Moses. Elijah showed that we were still on track. Now plans with Jesus. I think there's definitely some definite symbolism there. The remember in the passage we just read of Peter's reaction to Christ's mentioning of his suffering, I do think there's some interesting, what you might say, consoling of the disciples of, okay, you've now just been revealed this possible, what you may be thinking of as a tragic truth, that, that I will go and I will suffer, I will be, I will die at the hands of the Romans instead of liberating you from the Romans, that you may be thinking is, what was the plan. But now you are, I think this gives them a picture of, there's something very glorious about this. This is, that this plan will be great, and this is why the Messiah is here, and why the Messiah must go through this, is because it is going to create a more glorious plan. Why do you think Peter wanted to build booths? Why do you think he wanted to build tents?
Tabernacle of worship.
So tabernacle of worship, okay, that's what. All right, so that might be that. That's certainly. It's like, okay, we've got. This is probably assume this is the first time Peter ever saw Moses or Elijah. So probably thought this would be a good moment.
To have a servant heart, you have a guest come, you want to do all you can to make that guest comfortable. And it's like, they're here, I don't know how long they're going to be here, so let's give them a place to stay.
So I want to focus on the last word you said there, James, and that is stay. Because I think that's certainly part of it. I mean, this is a moment that, that it's like, when we're in a glorious reveal, let's make this moment kind of last as long as we can make it last. And I do think it's interesting right after this, it's almost like, okay, now the moment's going to end. Work to do, but I think there's, and you certainly don't fault, I think, Peter for that desire. It's like, okay, we can bask in this. This is awesome. We got Moses here, we got Elijah here. Let's live this up. Let's stay in this moment. But they do move on. Any other thoughts about this? I think this is a very neat part of the neat story here.
Well, we don't know. Do we know how long this lasted?
We do not.
Maybe it went through a day and it's getting evening.
Yeah, it could be. It could be. I mean, it could be that it could be. We know it was long enough for them to have whatever conversation they needed to have about this, and so. Now, Peter they don't seem to be worried about having any bread this time, so I guess there's some improvement there.
One interesting thing about this passage, I mean, if you think about Elijah, he never actually died, right?
That's
he
correct.
was taken up into heaven. And Jude talks about Moses, the archangel Michael, arguing with the devil about taking up his body.
Right.
So the assumption is, he was, raised in heaven. So they were seen as still active, I think.
Right. I think that, yes. Yeah. Elijah, like he said, Elijah never died, and Moses died under sort of interesting and unique circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
No one knows where he was buried, and and so there was, and yes, and so I do think they feel that these two were two people that were still active, and however that works in Israel's destiny. So yeah, I think that is significant about those two, and the way those two individuals. Okay. All right. Anything else? All right. lesson.
Well,